In a time of great pain after World War II, as well as the confusion and excitement of the growing industrialization period, art and literature took a really interesting turn as people reacted to their changing and chaotic environment of the 20th century. Authors such as T.S. Eliot, Virginia Woolf, and Oscar Wilde were only a few of the people that would really contribute to the confusing atmosphere. Modernism was a movement in literature and art in the beginning of the 20th century. It marked a period of experimentation and social changes, and a boom in industrialization, advancements in gender roles, as well as the emergence of things like photography and cinema and the telephone, the theory of relativity and X-rays, and so much more. There was a large growth and change in human behavior, and this would really influence the art and literature that would be created during this time. Some of the traits of modernism included this idea that the world is created in the act of perceiving it. There was also this sense of alienation, even in a period of a population boom. And there was a great break in tradition, as well as experimentation with the way stories were told. There was a new style called stream of consciousness, where people would no longer restrict themselves to the rules of writing a chronological story, and rather people would just lay their thoughts out on paper and just let their thoughts be. In The Love Song of J. Alfred Proofrock by T.S. Eliot, the city life was introduced with a yellow cloud of pollution, personified as a cat-like animal that was kind of lurking between the buildings. And although yellow is usually seen as this bright, happy, joyful color, here it is seen as dark and gloomy, as it is seen as pollution, and this cat-like animal that is covering the town is seen as slow and lazy, and at the same time a little bit clever and playful, as it kind of lurks between the buildings. The narrator uses words and phrases such as lingered, or rubbed its muzzle, licked its tongue into the corners of the evening, or slipped by the terrace and made a sudden leap, and seeing that it was a soft October night, curled once about the house and fell asleep. And this all gives the town a feeling of dark sleepiness, and really a little bit of playfulness at the same time. But the most important part of this is it introduces the theme of alienation and disconnect and feeling clouded. Throughout this whole poem, there's no description of faces and no particular people in the city, or even any description of people feeling love or joy or even sunshine. There's no bustling crowds, and rather there's talk of half-deserted streets and muttering retreats, and the women who come and go talking of Michelangelo. These women talking of Michelangelo are repeated throughout the whole piece, and while they are name-dropping a well-known artist, giving them a sense of importance and being highly educated, all being at this party together and talking, the feeling of them all coming and going and all speaking of the same things really gives this feeling that there really isn't ever anything new happening in this city. They're all kind of all the same. And all the people become a blur over time, especially with the repetition. And really, there's just nothing special about them. They're just kind of there, but they're always there. They always come back. And this really creates a sense of disconnect between the narrator and the party that he's at. There is also a description of high society that's kind of similar to The Importance of Being Earnest by Oscar Wilde, where people spend their free time and all their leisure time at parties and socialization and kind of arguing over ridiculous things and reading and creating art. And there is the description in Proofrock of the cups, the marmalade, the tea, among the porcelain, among some talk of you and me. And this is kind of similar to the images in Ernest of people in ridiculously fancy attire and spending their pastimes in kind of ridiculous scenes, where the two men in Ernest were, their time in the city was kind of a game to them. They spent their time being other people in the city. It wasn't ever really serious. It was just kind of a place for them to play games or to cheat on other people or to become something else. But with Proofrock, there was this complete lack of human connection that there was in Ernest, where in Ernest they at least spent most of their time, while not always interacting with the people around them, they were always socializing. There was always a large group setting that was always really important. There was also the importance of etiquette and how you presented yourself in front of other people, while in Proofrock there was no crowd. There was no people to impress. There was parties and socialization, but they were always so disconnected from the narrator. And the town ends up feeling worn, kind of like the old man describing it himself. And the stream of consciousness style makes everything really feel scattered. The Urban Nightmare article describes the city as the living death of city life, and talks about the startling comparison of the sky, where the narrator calls it the patient etherized upon a table, and how it is one of passive demobilization, stuck on the wheel in a clinical nightmare, unable to make true progress. And there is this sense of the narrator starting out in a more present state in the beginning, although he's still amongst this fog, this dense yellow fog. He gradually becomes disjointed over time. He speaks of the parties, and then goes on to question his own place in time and space, where he asks, "Do I dare disturb the universe?" Over time, we just leave the city, and we're lost in a fantasy world where we watch the narrator just standing on the sand, where he listens to the voices of the mermaids. He makes references to Prince Hamlet and Lazarus, and talks of previous times or fiction. But at the same time, he's weaving in and out of these moments quite often, where he comes back to envision himself in the present moment with his coffee spoons in his trousers, and how he is growing bald. And this is very different to Ernest, where everything is always chaotic and fast and always happening in Ernest, but they are always present. And this is not the case with Proofrock. The poem ends with, the human voices wake us and we drown. The human voices from the city are always distant and unclear, but they are what brings the narrator back to the present. The Urban Nightmare article again mentions that the human voices, all unnecessary and divisive tumult of modern society, still speak more loudly to Proofrock than does the natural roar of the sea. The result, paradoxically, is a different sort of drowning, the daily death in life of obsessive self-consciousness. Such disconnect and also really acute awareness of the city around him results in this mental drowning, and it is questionable whether the city really did exude this sense of disconnect in a time of industrialization. It must have, with so many people around you, so busy. But at the same time, it also could be the way the narrator sees the city, as a projection of his own mental state while stuck in such a busy place. In Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway, on the other hand, there's so much description of the bustling of the city and at the same time the wary connection between the citizens after the war. there is still a sense of disjointedness, and the stream of consciousness style is still there for sure. At the same time, the presence of the other townfolk make it feel less jaded and distant. There was also a quote where there was a description of the city. Though it was still so early, there was a beating, a stirring of galloping ponies, tapping of the cricket bats, lords, Ascot, Ranelagh, and all set down on their lawns and pitches on the bouncing ponies, whose forefeet just struck the ground and up they sprung, the whirling young men and laughing girls in their transparent muslins, who even now, after dancing all night, were taking their absurdly woolly dogs for a run. This goes on to continue to paint a picture of this lively scene filled with life. And there's a brief mention of the deaths of those in the war, and yet there's still the hope of, but it was over. Thank heaven, over. She goes on to mention how it was now June, and this was the beginning of a brighter time as well. In Proofrock is set in October, and the gradual settling darkness at twilight is enough to set the tone on its own. There is already an understandable feeling of confusion at this point of time, with shared trauma and change that affects the population as a whole. At the same time, each of these authors are experiencing really vastly different levels of darkness and disconnect. Some depending on social status, others perhaps by age. Each one of these groups experience a different level of disconnect from those around them. Mrs. Dalloway has practically a whole town trying to decipher a message in the sky together. The importance of being earnest shows the two men simply seeing their time in the city as a game and not really meant to be taken seriously. Socialization is important, but only as a high-class image thing. The love song of J. Alfred Proofrock displays almost a complete disconnect from the reality around the narrator entirely. Between these three stories, they display that regardless of the rush of people around oneself, there are still both personal and outside triumphs and downfalls that really influence how one interacts with their surroundings. Some collective traumas and struggles bring some together, while other groups find themselves kind of finding refuge in things such as money or even their own fantasy worlds. The city itself is simply a vessel to carry each of these individual stories, and somehow work as a hub to either bring them together or to even create a deeper sense of loneliness in the sea of people.